So we're really honored to have you, sir, on the panel. It's also a proud privilege this afternoon to invite the Principal Economic Advisor in the Finance Ministry, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, to moderate this session, and I'd like to invite him up. Globally acclaimed as an economist and an urban theorist, Mr. Sanyal, after 2 decades as a global economist, is now an insider who is witness to and part of the changing face of the Indian economy. Mr. Sanyal played a key role in ideating and implementing key policies, including the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. We are honored to have him on this panel as a participant and a moderator. Joining Mr. Sanyal is founder and managing director and CEO of Kotak Mahindra Bank, Mr. Uday Kotak, who is one of the most respected names in the Indian business today. Over the last 3 decades, Mr. Kotak has founded and led India's first non-banking finance company to become among the country's most valued banks. Mr. Kotak is the ultimate symbol of Indian entrepreneurship and is a great believer in building a fully, truly Indian company, and he takes pride in doing it in a way that competes and outdoes global standards. But beyond everything, Mr. Kotak is someone who speaks his mind and speaks it straight on matters within and beyond. Also joining us on this session is the director of the Centennial Group International and the founding director and CEO of Centennial Asia Advisors, Mr. Manu Bhaskaran. With over 3 decades of experience in risk assessment and providing policy and strategic advisory on Asia, Mr. Bhaskaran has astute insight into the role of India vis-à-vis the global economy. Mr. Bhaskaran is regarded as a leading commentator on Asian financial and economic affairs, believes India can become one of the top 3 global economic powers in 30 years. I'm told Mr. Bhaskaran has traveled from Singapore to join us on this panel, and so we are really excited to have him with us as much as we want to hear his views on a booming super economy. It's over to you, Mr. Sanyal.
Thank you very much. It's indeed a pleasure to be here. So let me begin by thanking Republic TV for this opportunity to come here and speak to all of you on what I think is going to be a very interesting topic, which is a global economy powered by India. And of course, we do this at a time when India's economy is arguably the fastest growing economy in the world. And not just that, we have now sustained these kinds of growth, high growth rates for some time. So this is not a flash in the pan thing. And we are doing this also without our macro indicators flying out of kilter. So this is when inflation is under control, whether fiscal or credit indicators remain well within responsible limits. So there's every expectation that this sort of growth effort can be sustained, perhaps built upon, and of course the wider place in the world of India that we hope that India will be able to fill out. So without further ado, let me turn to my panel, and I'm going to start with Mr. Barroso. You just spoke about the place of India in a world that is rapidly changing. So perhaps you could give us a flavor about, you've seen India for a long time. So in what sense has kind of India's place changed, say, over the last decade in terms of how you would have thought about India, seeing it from Europe, and how you think it could potentially change into the future, especially given that the world we are entering is clearly liquefying into a very different kind of environment than what was the case in the last 20 years.
Thank you. I'm no longer in public office, so I usually say my level of sincerity is increasing day by day. So I'm going to tell you very frankly. We need by the way, we admire the work done by India. I think there has been clearly improvements, and I congratulate you for that, in economic reform, in more openness. That is certainly a great development. But I really believe, because I want to be sincere, there is still a great potential. There is still a great potential. In Europe, we'd like to see, we know about the rise of China, of India, of Asia in general. The rise of China is now, a reality. Let me tell that in the early 80s, or in the 80s, I was young deputy foreign minister when we're speaking about the world, in competitiveness terms, we're speaking about the United States, of course, besides Europe, the United States, Japan, the so-called Asian tigers, including Singapore and Korea. But there was never a mention of China. Today, we start our discussions always with China. So India is rising. There is certainly a surge of India, but there are still reforms to do. And if I may share with you one point that I believe is important, is the issue of foreign trade and investment. More openness there. During many years, when I was leading the European Commission, I had many summits with the authorities in India, either here in India, namely in New Delhi, or in Europe, namely in Brussels. And in fact, while we were able to launch very important trade agreements, some of them have now been concluded, from Singapore to Korea to Canada, Central America, Peru, Colombia, now recently Japan, it was not possible to move sufficiently with India. So this is, because I think you want a candid discussion and a very open discussion, this is a point where I believe we could do more, and specifically in terms of relationship with Europe. If I may make another suggestion, don't just look at Europe to the United Kingdom. By the way, unfortunately, very soon I'm afraid that the United Kingdom will no longer be part of the European Union. So we have to look at Europe as a whole, not only as the United Kingdom, who of course is an extremely important country, but to look at the European Union as a whole, all the opportunities that Europe offers, but also to look at it not only as a trade partner, but as an important global player that can be, in fact, an important also partner for India's development. And one specific issue is in terms of investment. I know there are some efforts going on between the European Union and India to launch a kind of a treaty in terms of investment. I think that could be a very important contribution, because one thing I'm sure, when you look at demographics, when you look at your very talented people, when you look at the reforms that have been launched and the recent improvements, I'm sure this country is going to continue to grow at a very important levels, and that can be good, of course, for the Indians themselves, but also for a more balanced, global, sustainable growth.
Thank you. I mean, basically the point you're making is India can do a lot more, but I think the perspective that you are coming from is that clearly we are in some ways punching below our weight.
Exactly.
Is that, and I'll come back to this point again. Moving to Manu. Manu is of course an old friend. He's also incidentally probably the best known economist in Southeast Asia. And so sitting in Singapore, looking from the east, so to speak, how has India's place in the world changed from where it was, say, a decade ago? Same question as I asked Mr. Barroso. And how do you think it could evolve into the future?
Thank you, Sanjeev. And let me just thank the organizers for inviting me here. And it's great to be here with Sanjeev, my old friend, and with other luminaries here to comment on India. The overall point I would like to make in response is that we in ASEAN are inspired and indeed exhilarated by India's growing footprint in the world. And let me say three things to expand on that. First, geostrategically, East and Southeast Asia has become a real arena for big power contestation. We have an assertive China, and we have a US that's not going to let go. And that's making for a tense situation. The only other power that can possibly balance these two and produce an outcome that is more comfortable for the smaller countries in ASEAN is India. I mean, Europe is too far away, Japan is too small. Only India has the heft to make that difference by balancing these two other nations. So geostrategically, India is so important right now. Second point I'd like to make is on the economy. How did China rise? China went from a minuscule share of world exports to about 15% in the matter of 15 years. Not many people realize it, but it did so by using Southeast Asia as a kind of force multiplier. China linked its supply chains with the globally competitive manufacturing clusters around Bangkok and the eastern seaboard of Thailand, the northern part of the Malay Peninsula, the southern part of Malaysia bordering Singapore, and the industrial townships around Jakarta. These are globally competitive clusters that provided the components that allowed China to become competitive. So it was really China plus ASEAN together as a conglomerate that became competitive against the rest of the world, gained market share, and both benefited. We think that we can do the same thing with India. Indian companies that globalize can build supply chains out into Southeast Asia, gain from their competitiveness, and together, India and ASEAN can become very competitive against the rest of the world. So that's the economic dimension. The third point, and really this takes upon what José just said, we would like in ASEAN to deepen that relationship and to make it more concrete. And one of the mechanisms that we've been trying to work through is something called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. Unfortunately, that huge trade agreement, which would produce the largest free trade area in the world, is delayed because ASEAN and India just somehow can't seem to get over some of the differences they have on issues like services trade and so on. So we would really hope that there could be some demonstration of leadership that can overcome that so that we can really bring the relationship to a much higher plane and achieve the potential.
So again, I think both of you make the point that, look, clearly India's done radically better than what it used to do. I mean, clearly it's an important player, everybody recognizes it, but in some ways we still seem to, one, not punch up to our weight, but also an additional dimension that Manu brought in was that this cannot be seen purely in economic terms. This has to be seen in geopolitical terms and in grand historical terms, because this is one of those moments in history. And in fact, I'll just go back to Mr. Barroso again. Look back 15 years back. What are the things that, say, a country like China, which was then emerging, was doing that you think maybe we can emulate in order to sort of increase our footprint in mind space in Europe?
No, I mean, China was always looking at European as such. They also have bilateral relationship with different countries, but they looked at European Union as such. To be very frank, I think India was looking almost, I mean, I will not say exclusively, but mostly to the United Kingdom. And there is something around the United Kingdom. That's the European Union. Let me tell you, during the financial crisis, and I lived that in a dramatic way, we felt the support of China. In the most difficult moments of the financial crisis, when many people were betting against, for instance, Greece was going to leave the euro, that against the periphery countries, Chinese were buying the bonds of the periphery countries. I spoke at that time several times with Chinese leadership. They were really committed. That's the reality. Now, at the same time, I think the Chinese, and they have a plan, they have a strategy, a long-term strategy, and they put all the resources of the state in a very effective state. We may agree or not with their political system. Certainly, we have different political systems in Europe and in India as well. But we have to recognize that their capacity of delivery from a state point of view is really high. So this is the reality. And today, China is the second partner of the European Union. So the United States, first, in trade terms, United States, China comes immediately afterwards. The third is Switzerland, very small, but very close. Fourth is Russia. So you see, and if you look at how was China, let's say 15 years ago, and how is China today in relationship to Europe, is incomparably stronger. That's the reality. So I'm not suggesting that you have to do exactly as China has done, but I'm saying that we have to be humble. All of us have to be humble and also to understand what we can do better. And from that point of view, certainly, China has been doing, for instance, they've never missed a summit with the European Union. There was once a problem because of Tibet, that here they did not want to make the agreement, the summit with us. But the following year, the Prime Minister came to see me and said, this year we need to do 2 summits, because last year we could not do because of Tibet. So I saw also, besides the economy and trade, I saw a political investment. And I like to see that political investment both ways also, from India in Europe, but also from the European Union in India. I think we should do more things together.
So it's quite clear that, I mean, there is great hopes from India. We are clearly, again, as I keep mentioning, doing a lot better than we used to. But of course, at the end of it, this whole thing is based on the ability of India to keep its economy growing at very high growth rates. I think this year we became larger than the UK and now are the 5th largest economy in the world. We, I think, will become next year the 4th largest economy in the world, bypassing, I think, France, if I'm not mistaken. So again, or it's the other way around. I think we will now be 5th after France, and I think it's still smaller than Germany, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, nevertheless, still good, 5th largest economy in the world. But of course, this whole thing is based on keeping this economy growing at very high growth rates. So I'm going to turn to you then. How do we keep this machine running at these high growth rates and sustain it maybe over a generation, which is basically what we need to do? Because remember, by the middle of the 2020s, we will have the world's largest labor force. And with all, the potential there may be, this is about deploying that labor force, integrating it with the global supply chains, and really making it count.
No, Sanjeev, I must first give a reality check to us all Indians. India needs to grow, to really surge at a rate of 9% per annum real GDP for the next 20 years to get to where China is today. Therefore, if India grows at 9% for 20 years, we will get to where China is today. I'm not even counting how much China will progress in that period of a much larger base. So when we really are talking about surging ahead, this is the reality. I don't think 7% is good enough for what India needs to be. And it truly has to be surging ahead. At its crucial periods within the 15 years, Chinese economy grew at 8, 9, 10%. And that is where India needs to be. The question in my mind is how? And we have a whole host of challenges, okay? And this is where I think we need to play it smarter. I see, for example, many segments of the Indian economy. India has been a far more open economy for investment, which is a good thing, but which also means we need to be strategic. You take our e-commerce sector, a lot of our digital space is basically effectively controlled by the Googles and the Facebooks and others. So as we go forward, how are we going to make sure that we have the ability of growing in the new digital areas, which we have actually giving up space to a lot of the global players? And it is here that we cannot play the game China played over the last 15 years. We have to play our game, which is relevant today.
So what is that game?
And it is simple. I mean, since we are here at the Republic TV event, for India to be truly a global power or truly surging ahead, Republic TV India should aspire to be ahead of CNN worldwide. That is the kind of aspiration we need from Indian businesses and Indian entrepreneurs. I must share a story which is a story of mine in early 1990s. When I made my first trip to the US, I'd read a number of books. And I was quite stunned going to New York and seeing the mighty JP Morgans and Merrill Lynch's and Goldman Sachs and what global institutions these American firms had become over 100 years. And I came back with a small wish. Why can't we in India create such institutions of global scale and quality which will make India proud? And it is stuff like this that we should be doing with a passion and a purpose which is unmatched. That's what we need.
So this is actually quite interesting because in some ways what you're saying is we don't merely talk about growth, but the growth has to be embodied in champion companies, so to speak, in a sense. Now, easier said than done. How do we go about this? And, in some ways, for example, how did China create them? It opened up in a certain way, but on the other hand, it provided enormous protection, enormous support for massive clustering, sometimes, violating WTO norms and so on. How would we, given our political system and presumably with, attempting also to remain within certain set of global norms, that we may not get the free pass that, say, China got it at a certain point in history?
I think Indian companies don't require negative protection. What we need really is an ability to play without having the negative energy of the lot of systems and bureaucracy which very often we encounter. And this is where I think we need, and I think it's not just the government of the day, it is the broader political system which from time to time gets extremely populist. For example, the latest flavor of the town is loan waivers. I'm not against loan waivers because on the other hand, there is also business and industry, as the Prime Minister rightly said, which has misused the financial system. But my point to you is, for us to really grow world class, we need a market economy where we trust markets and have high quality regulation which oversees these markets. And fundamental issue is the system must trust markets with proper regulation. And I think we have some way to go in that.
So let me turn to Manu here. So clearly the East Asian countries, China of course being the latest version of it, but there was a certain model, so to speak. High investment rates, driven by high savings rates, pumping out large amounts of infrastructure, but also capacities in high capital-intensive industry. And so this was a certain model of growth. Now, is it something that we should aspire to replicate here in India? And if so, and I'll come back to Uday on this, whether our financial system is capable of delivering. But quite without even going down that path, the question is this a path even open to us? I mean, technology is just changing. We're going to have AI. We are going to do it in a world which may be much more protectionist than in the past. So is this a path we should even bother to pursue? If not, what else should we do?
Yeah, I think each of the East Asian states actually had their own version of a model. But there are some commonalities. And one is state capacity. So the state has to do the right things and avoid doing the wrong things. It has to create the right enabling environment for the private sector to get on with it. So you talked about investment rates and savings rates. These don't come out of magic. They come out because the economic incentives embedded in the system encourage those companies without the state having to tell a company to do this or that, right? So state capacity to build infrastructure, to build and regulate a proper financial system so that financial savings are mobilized in the right way, education is provided, social safety nets where they are necessary, so that things work and hang together. I think that's absolutely critical. And that is what is common across all the various East Asian models. Yes, technology is changing, but technology is always changing. And throughout the last 60 years, when East Asia rose, there were many challenges and changes, globalization of various kinds. Technology is another change that the system can handle. So
would you argue that, no, people tend to give the impression that AI is somehow a fundamental break. You would think that this is a much more continuity.
We have seen so many technological revolutions. Some of these breathless reports out of some universities saying that 46% or whatever of jobs are going to be lost. I don't believe them. If you look at a job, what is a job? A job usually is comprised of 13, 20, 25 separate activities. Some of these activities will be displaced by AI and so on. The others will be complemented. So it's not a case of wholesale job destruction. The composition of jobs will change. Yes, there will be disruption. Some industries will be disrupted. Some people will be laid off. And that is where state capacity comes in as well. Because the state has to intervene to help those who cannot be helped, the older workers, with social safety nets. You have to help those who can help themselves by providing lifelong learning and other forms of helping people to cope with it and helping small businesses to cope with it. So again, it comes back to how do governments enact policies to support the right kind of change in line with technology. You can't fight technology.
So in fact, that brings a very important point here, which is about innovation and risk-taking, because clearly the point Manu is making is that this is about how your economy adapts to the technology rather than trying to protect some old system of doing things. This is about how you can do it and do it quickly. And obviously, the most important ingredient in this is the ability of the financial system to finance all of this, allow for, of course, not only allocation of capital more efficiently, but also when things go wrong to liquefy them. And of course, that's what the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code and so on is. So I'm going to now turn to Uday. You run a bank. You're obviously also now running ILNFS. Clearly, there are this. It requires. You will appreciate. It requires a financial system that is very, very flexible, able to identify risks, make mistakes quickly, and then move on from them by liquefying them. Is this something we are moving towards? To what extent is the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code a major step in that direction? What else do we need to do?
No, I think you mentioned about ILFS. Let me say that that's a role I've taken up, humbled by the responsibility as national duty. And when you look at the situation like ILFS, you come back and ask various layers of what are required as a core basis of a sound financial institution in the making, which is management, board, shareholders, auditors, rating agencies, regulators. These are all checks and balances of a system for building a sound financial system. And one has to ask the question, why did the different layers have the pressure they did in the case of the ILFS situation? And how do we make our entire financial system far more robust to be able to sustain shocks coming out of what are really problems on checks and balances of our financial system? I think the key issue for us is also we have a very large state-owned banking system. We have a private sector banking system which is now disproportionately owned by global investors. We have a situation where the non-bank financial companies have a model which is fundamentally hugely wholesale funded, and therefore with the pressures coming out of that as the third aspect of the whole thing. I think we really need to reimagine and rejuvenate the whole vision of our financial system. I do hope that post-2019 one of the top items on the agenda has to be a dramatic reimagination of the future of Indian finance if we want to support an economy at 9 to 10% GDP growth.
Yeah, in fact, and I'll come to Manu as well on this, but let me get your answer. Really, if you do all the math, if you want a 9% GDP growth rate, you need an investment rate well in excess of 35% of GDP. That's the only way we can do it. Are our banks genuinely capable of driving that kind without again going through the same cycle of misallocating capital, growing too quickly? We've just been through that.
No, Sanjeev, there's one lesson I've learned in the financial system over my 30-odd years in the system, is one of the most underrated aspects of financial system and financial sector is the importance of risk management. And it's an issue which governments, companies from time to time dramatically underestimate the challenge. Very often it is very boring. Okay, it doesn't have the glamour, and the whole aspect of risk at the core of a sound financial system is something which needs to be deeply embodied. And here, for us to be able to have the investments rates we need to really ask the question that at times, is our whole thinking on interest rates and this real interest rates, do we run the risk of being too Puritan? Are we probably going too theoretical economic policy? And if, say, for example, our inflation today is, say, 3%, 3.5% CPI, 6.5 repo sounds high, and then you add the credit spreads and everything else, we are talking about 6 to 7% real interest rates for borrowers. And that is an extremely high rate of
That's for large borrowers.
Yeah.
Small borrowers are, almost a 900 basis
and
points.
The question to my mind is, when there are physical bottlenecks, is a purest way of looking at interest rates alone in the context of broader economic development something we need to rejig? I am not against the principle of real interest rates, but how do we really think about this holistically from a inflation point of view and development point of view? Like the US Fed doesn't have the concept of targeting inflation alone. It's inflation and growth and employment. So how are we getting ourselves into a box? That is the question in my mind.
So let me go back to Manu, and then I'll turn to Mr. Barroso after that. So high growth, backed by a huge amount of investment. India, unlike many other countries entering into this phase, has attempted at least to do a genuinely good job of cleaning up the banking system, put in place insolvency and bankruptcy code. It has tried to recapitalize it, tried to be a good citizen. Basic idea is we shouldn't end up with the Asian crisis, because clearly Southeast Asia also attempted to do this and then floundered after doing it for a while because its banking system gave up. Now, what is your assessment of what are the things that need to be done beyond what we have just done in order to make sure our financial system can take this right, i.e. a dramatic expansion, but avoid what, the blow-up of the Asian crisis?
Let me answer this in two parts. I mean, the first thing is I wouldn't overemphasize the role of interest rates. The most important thing in raising your investment rate to exciting levels is the rate of return on capital. Businesses will happily pay a high interest rate if you have a fantastic rate of return. So the key question is, why is there not a return on capital in India that incentivizes entrepreneurs to go out and invest, as they did in all the high growth economies? So that's the key thing. What is holding back those rates of return? Is it poor infrastructure? Is it regulation? Is it scale? What? Is it the labor market? I mean, I think those are the more fundamental issues that have to be tackled. I agree with Uday completely. I think India must be much more ambitious. Go for 9 to 10% growth, because it's only with those high rates of growth that you can bring the poorest segments of the economy, of the people, really up. On the role of the financial sector, we have to be really careful. We learned the hard way in Southeast Asia that if you neglect the financial sector, if you treat it with callousness, it can really hobble you. And we lost 10 years and more because of that, and you can't afford that. So a well-regulated financial sector is very important. And if credit costs are high, we should ask why. Is it because non-performing loans tend to be high? Are we confident that the new code will bring those credit costs down? I would counsel patience. Don't rush into this, because if there's one thing that keeps tripping up developing countries, it is financial mistakes. Look at Vietnam, fantastic supply side potential, but over the last 20 to 30 years of their reform era, constantly has been tripped up by poor regulation of the banking sector and by poor management of inflation.
So we are going to have to end very soon. So let me give the last question to Mr. Barroso. You already heard the ambitions India has. Not only is it already the fastest growing major economy in the world, it intends to go faster. Now, that's obviously a great ambition, but in a world that you yourself described, where many things are liquefying, whether it's the trade patterns, clearly the social attitudes towards trade and so on, do you think there is actually a space for a country like India? It's a large country, so clearly, is it something that the global community can make space for?
I think India, you have the space. Others may not have the space. You'll be soon the biggest country on earth by population. You have, by the way, I think that demographic dividend is one of the greatest assets for India in terms of the market development. So I really believe that's all in your favor. One thing we know, there are different paths for development and growth all over the world. But when we see the most successful countries in the world, and I don't consider the most successful only in terms of growth, but in terms of social development, of literacy, life expectancy, child mortality. When you look at the most successful countries in the world, I believe that there are at least three things in common. One is state efficiency. Rule of law, state efficiency, the capacity of the state to work, to deliver, so transparency, fight against corruption. This is the first thing, state efficiency. Second, infrastructure. And by the way, I've heard your Prime Minister today, the commitment that he has expressed on infrastructure. The potential for development of infrastructure in this country is really huge. The third, probably the most important, is education. Education, not only of the young people, but other people that have to adapt to new technologies. So these are the three issues, education, infrastructure, state capacity, that can help countries to develop. And when I was listening to you now, I was thinking the Chinese like to speak about socialist with Chinese characteristics. Maybe what you can do here is capitalism with Indian characteristics. Because this country has indeed a great potential. You have all the elements in terms of the potential of your market. You are very talented working people. You have one of the most bright diasporas in the world. I've been in touch all my life from the United States to Europe to Africa. By the way, let me also highlight Africa. If there is one country outside Africa that knows something about Africa, it's India. India can do much more in Africa. And Africa, that sometimes people look with some contempt, is indeed one of the great reserves of future growth. So I continue to think that India is surging, and India, in fact, can surge more, benefiting from the potential it has and the great capabilities that this country has.
So, before I end, I'm going to give a last word to Uday. What would it feel like to be a capitalist with Indian characteristics?
No, I think, for me, if capitalist with Indian characteristics, if there's one thing which really we need to transform India on is our competitiveness for exports. Okay? And all our lives, we have been used to what I call as a P&L account negative, which means imports greater than exports. If we really want to be world-class Indian era of the future, we must be able to pay for our bills. And we should not be vulnerable to price of oil in terms of our ability to pay our bills. And that requires a dramatic increase in competitiveness. And we must go back to the old saying which I learned in my college days in commerce, which is export or perish. Only then can we really power the world. Exports is something we have to dramatically change.
Thank you, Uday. Thank you, Mr. Barroso. Thank you, Manu. I think with that, let me hand the mic back to the moderator.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Sanyal, Mr. Kotak, Mr. Bhaskaran, and Mr. Barroso. Ladies and gentlemen, a fantastic panel. Thank you very much.